Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Haley Deal. I'm here with my colleague, Lindsay Chang. We're both SLPs. We work together in an outpatient setting at Stanford Children's, primarily in the area of AAC. We're happy you could join us today to talk about enhancing AAC access for individuals with complex access needs. So first, here are our disclosures. Lindsay and I both receive a salary from Stanford Medicine, Children's Health, and we both have non-financial working relationships with various SGD vendors, some of whom we'll be mentioning in this talk. I'm also a member of Isaac and ASHA SIG 12, and I'm a sibling of a person with complex communication needs, and Lindsay has been a guest lecturer at San Francisco State. So these are our learning objectives for today. We hope that after this presentation, you'll be able to explain how individuals who require alternative access methods could be impacted, could be impacted by the display design of a dynamic display AAC system, talk about the best practices for positioning an SGD for a person who requires access via eye gaze, and talk about the cognitive and motor demands that are involved in operating an AAC device using switch scanning. We're going to start out by talking about a framework for decision-making when it comes to designing an AAC system. Then we'll talk a little bit more about different access methods, including touch, using a mouse or joystick, eye gaze, and switch scanning. We are going to save some time at the end for questions, so please hold your questions until then. Also, if we don't have a chance to get to your question today, we will be including our email addresses on a later slide, so please feel free to email us questions later on. So why is it important for us to talk about access? Well, it's because understanding access is one of the ways that we can make sure that we have the right fit between the user, the technology, and the tasks that they intend to use the technology for. It really isn't enough for us to just give someone a tool. We have to make sure that it's the right tool for the job and that it's tailored to the individual who's going to use it. Especially for AAC users who have more complex motor or vision needs, they can be particularly vulnerable to the effects of a poor fit between the technology and their needs. So we really need to become familiar with the different access options that are available, as well as tailoring the AAC system to make it as user-friendly as possible. So let's say that you're meeting this little guy for the first time for an AAC evaluation. Where would you start? In some cases, when we're thinking about AAC, we might move quickly to thinking about different language systems and vocabulary needs. But for a person with more complex access needs, we may need to take a step back and consider what our best access setup would be like in real-world situations, and we may need to use a more detailed approach. So to help us do this, there's an excellent framework that was proposed by Dawn Sowers and Krista Wilkinson in 2023. Looking at this framework, you can see that there are many different factors that we need to consider in AAC, and that these factors are interrelated. When we're assessing these areas, we sometimes have to zoom in and focus on a particular area and gather more information, and then step back to think about how these different pieces are working together. So let's first think about how we might define the needs of an AAC user. On an individual level, the person who uses AAC is going to have certain needs that are based on their particular skills and any medical conditions that they might have. We also need to consider that the goal of AAC is to help this person to communicate and participate in everyday activities. So we need to consider what different environments they're going to spend time in, what activities they participate in, and what support systems they're going to have available to them at different times. Then moving on to assessing the demands, we're going to need to think about the unique demands that are involved in using AAC to communicate for this particular person. So this is going to include cognitive demands on their attention and memory, sensory processing demands, and motor demands that are involved in accessing the AAC system. These needs and demands are both going to influence our decisions about an access setup. Any access setup is probably going to involve certain trade-offs. So for example, if there's an AAC user who really needs to be very accurate, they might need to make a compromise on speed because AAC tends to be so much slower than communicating by speaking. So in that case, maybe an AAC user could program a pre-programmed message for certain situations like going to the doctor, and they could access those at a later time. That allows them time to use a robust system that may take them more time to access and still be able to participate in those activities like communicating with their doctor. In other situations, maybe communicating more quickly is really the priority. So they might use a different access setup For example, if somebody needed to communicate with a service dog and they needed a quick way to signal come to that dog, they might hit something like a Big Mac, and that's not going to give them robust communication, but it might work for that particular task. So you see in the middle, there's the arrow representing time. And this is really talking about over time, the person who's using AAC is going to gain experience operating their AAC system. This is going to make their access more stable and flexible. As that happens, the cognitive linguistic demands or the cognitive demands of using AAC can go down. So let's look more closely at how we might evaluate and define needs on an individual level. So these are standard components of any AAC assessment. We need to know about an individual's current means of communication, the motor skills that they have for positioning and access to an AAC device, their sensory perceptual skills, particularly their hearing and vision, their language and cognitive abilities, and their preferences, both in terms of what they want to communicate about, as well as specific preferences that they might have in relation to AAC. And we also need to understand what their prognosis looks like so that we can anticipate their needs over time. We use information from all of these areas to identify the features of an AAC system that might match that person's needs, and then match the AAC system to those features. We also need to define access needs in relation to the environments where the person is going to spend time, the activities that they participate in, and the support systems that they have available at different times. Different environments may present different levels of distraction, and the environment could also impact the feasibility of certain AAC setups. For example, direct sunlight can affect accuracy of eye tracking. And access might also look different for a person when they're laying supine in bed versus when they're seated up in their wheelchair. It's important to note that we don't necessarily need to use one single AAC tool for all of these different situations. We might have different tools and strategies that we use at different times. We should also consider that communication partners may have different, I'm skipping ahead. So AAC might also be needed to support various communication tasks, like alerting somebody in an emergency, participating in face-to-face one-on-one interactions, group interactions, written expression, and telecommunication. And support systems can vary. So somebody who's more familiar with a partner might have more ability to make inferences based on their unaided forms of communication versus an unfamiliar partner. Partners can also have varying levels of skill in terms of setting up the AAC system. So in some situations, we might not achieve the same optimal positioning that we would if we had a highly skilled partner who's able to set them up. So once we define the needs that exist on all of these levels, we need to assess the demands. And it's important to think about some of the unique cognitive and linguistic demands that are involved in using AAC to communicate. For those of us who primarily communicate by speaking, we can usually focus on the linguistic act of speech itself. So we can listen to what our partner says, we can think about what we want to say, and we don't really have to pay very much attention to the motor act of speech. There are some situations where we might experience this, such as if we have a motor speech disorder or if we're learning a new language with a different phonology. But for the most part, we're thinking about the messages that are being sent and received. For a person who uses AAC, they still have to pay attention to their partner and think about what it is that they want to say. But in addition to that, they also may need to navigate through multiple pages to find their vocabulary. They might need to remember most efficient paths to get there, locate vocabulary in a complex array on a page, and they might also need to inhibit potential responses to a distraction. So, and distractions that can be posed by the AAC system itself. So for example, if I'm having a conversation with Lindsay and she asks me, where do you want to go on vacation? I might use my AAC system and I'm looking for places, and I'm going to tell her, oh, I want to go to Wales. So I go there, but then when I land on my places page, I see so many other options that it causes me to become a little distracted and have thoughts about those other places I might go. So I have to inhibit those responses. So doing all of this can place a lot of demands on the attention and working memory of the person who's using AAC. We also want to consider that for people who have more significant motor impairments, they can have difficulty executing some of the motor acts itself. So this has some additional effects. This can use up a lot of energy and cause fatigue. It can significantly slow down the rate of communication. It may require them to focus a lot more on the motor task, so, taking away the attention that they could otherwise use for other tasks. And it might also add working memory demands, for example, for somebody who has to hold scanning sequences in their working memory. So all of this can mean that for a person who is using an alternative access method, they might have difficulty participating in a language task, not because they lack the language capacity, but because the motor demands placed on them at that moment are so high. So let's come back to our framework. So we've talked about defining the needs, and we've talked about assessing the demands. In a moment, we're going to turn to focusing on our access setup, but first I want us to think about how access evolves over time. So we know it takes time to develop the skills that are needed to physically access an AAC device. One of the ways we can relate to this is to think about when you were first learning to drive. So at that point, you had to give a lot more conscious thought to the tasks involved in driving, like which which foot to use for the brake versus the gas, and making sure that you would turn on your indicator light before changing lanes. At first, those behaviors just weren't automatic, so you had to be more conscious of them. And maybe something like listening to the radio at full blast would have caused too much distraction, and so you had to turn the radio down or keep the radio off when you were driving. Over time, as you got more skill and practice with driving, some of those things became automatic, and so you were able to carry on a conversation or keep the radio on when you were driving. And you were also more able to respond to changes. As if something happened that was unexpected on the road, you could respond more quickly without really having to think about it as much as you would otherwise. So the situation is similar for people who use AAC. At first, it requires a lot of cognitive resources just to physically operate the device. As they gain practice, it can become more fluent and a more stable and flexible process. So Sowers and Wilkinson illustrated this process as a continuum, which you can see here. So starting with the red arrow on the left, you see that for this person, their access skills are unstable and inflexible. So at this stage, they are focused primarily on the motor act of operating the device. And they don't really have as many resources to allocate to the language components of communication. Over time, they are going to develop skills and their access is going to become more stable, but not yet flexible. So this means that at this point, they can think about some of the language acts involved in communication, but they might only be able to do that in certain situations with some support with familiar partners. It might not be something that they can apply in more flexible situations. They could be more easily thrown off when things change. And finally, as we move to the green arrow on the right, then at this point we have stable and flexible access. So at this point, the person has the resources to focus primarily on the linguistic act of communication because most of their operational skills have become automatic. So now let's move on to the different access setups that we might consider. First, we're going to start out with direct selection by touch, which is where a person makes the selection by physically touching the display. That's usually with a finger or part of the hand, but it could also be using another body part or another tool. So some of the challenges that somebody might face when they're using direct selection by touch include things like limitations in range of motion, difficulty making precise selections, or difficulty repeating a motion, and fatigue. There are a number of modifications that we could consider for somebody who's having some of these difficulties. For example, we might consider doing something like using a stylus or adding a key guard to the device that might help them make more accurate selections. We could also consider if the reason for them having trouble accessing is more due to vision versus motor issues, we might consider using something like a tactile guide. So a tactile guide is basically something that allows the person to find landmarks of some kind that they use to locate vocabulary. This could be as simple as just using the edges of the display as their landmarks. It could also be things like using a tactile key guard. In the bottom right, you see one that's designed for Lamp Words for Life for their visually impaired version. This one has little raised areas on the key guard. It's a little hard to see in the image, but there's basically little bumps and lines that they're able to feel. You could also make something like this. You could take a key guard and add things like adhesive dots or Velcro to the key guard to make it easier to feel. We can also make some adjustments to the touch access settings that are in the device. So for example, We might change the access settings so that a selection activates the moment that we touch the screen, or it could activate the moment that we lift our finger up from the screen. We can also adjust the settings to ignore selections for a certain period of time after we make a selection. This is something that you sometimes see called a release time. I'm going to show you an example of that here, but let me make sure I'm sharing my audio. Okay, so I'll show you the first video here on the left. And in this video, the person is trying to hit the word drink, but their finger kind of skims some other symbols as they're coming off of the screen.
Drink, orange juice, soda.
So one way we could accommodate for that is we could add that release time, and that would allow them some time to move their finger off of the screen. So you'll see that here on the right. They're still going to make the same movement, but in this case, because we've added a release time, it's just going to activate when they touch down on drink.
Drink.
Another thing we could add is a dwell time. So this is a little different from release. It basically is the length of time that you have to rest your finger on the display before it activates.
Drink.
Oop, let's see. There we go. So another type of modification we could make are display design modifications. So these are things like adjusting the size of icons, the spacing between icons, or the location. It could also be things like how we move from one page to another in the system. So here you see an example of a design for somebody who did need to use the edges of the display to help them locate targets and also to stabilize their hands. So you can see that in this case, we only have vocabulary on the outer edges. We don't have anything in the center because they didn't have access to that. So now we're going to move on and briefly talk about using adaptive mice or joysticks. So there are many different styles of adaptive mice and joysticks available. These include some of the standard commercial mice that are available, ergonomic mice that come in so many different styles. You could also consider whether using a trackpad would be more effective. A small trackpad, such as the one you see in the top left, would be something we might consider for somebody who maybe has good distal finger control, but they don't have very good proximal movement of their arms. So it might be easier if they can just do very small finger movements to control the device. You might also consider a rollerball mouse. There are ones of different sizes and that use a different placement for the rollerball. There are also some like the one that you see in the top center that are switch adapted. So the person can use the rollerball to move to the target, and then they can hit a switch that they use to select. There are also a lot of different styles of joystick. And in the case of somebody who already is using a joystick to drive a power wheelchair, it may be possible to configure the joystick for the power wheelchair to pair with a device. For somebody who really needs to use switches, if they're able to access the device with more than one, with 3 or more switches, you can sometimes create a switch array that allows them to simulate mouse functions. And for people who aren't going to use their hands to operate a mouse, you might consider something like head tracking or a foot mouse, or there's also joystick operated joysticks that are operated with chin movements or mouth movements. So one set of modifications that we might make to the selection method for people using mice or joysticks affect the behavior when they're making selections. So you could adjust the mouse speed, you could change the appearance of the cursor, or you could add some sort of visual feedback. For example, you could add a zoom where it zooms in on the icon, or it highlights the cell, or you could add auditory feedback, which could just be a click sound when they're hitting their selection, or you could add auditory feedback that lets them hear the targets. So as they hover the mouse over it, maybe it says it out loud so that they can hear what their selections are. And then they would click again and hear it in a different voice when they're actually selecting it. We can also make changes to the activation technique. So the person might use a right or left click on a standard mouse. They might activate a switch. They might dwell by just hovering their mouse on a specific target, or they could use something like facial movements to activate a switch. So that would look something like this example from Smile Mouse. I'm not going to play the sound, it's just music. But you can see he's using movements from his head to change the location of the mouse, and then he's doing a smile to click. And this one you can change to different types of facial movements. So now I'm going to move on to direct selection using eye gaze. I'm going to focus on high-tech eye gaze here, but don't forget about low-tech eye gaze. It can be wonderful too. So let's first talk about how eye tracking works. Most eye tracking systems that are used in AAC use something called infrared pupil corneal reflection. So what this means is that the eye tracking camera is emitting a near infrared light that's bathing the user's face in light. And then light is then being reflected off of the user's eyes and picked up by the camera. So the camera is specifically looking for the center of the pupil and certain reflections off of the cornea. And it uses those points to interpret the images and make an estimate based on certain algorithms and mathematical models of how eyes work. It takes that and kind of plugs it into their data and then tries to guess where the user is looking. All of these are going to have a certain working range. It's varying by manufacturer. Some are as much as 30 inches or so from the user's face, but often it's a little bit closer than that, but it can't be too close, otherwise it can't track. If the user moves either too close or too far away or outside of the head box to either side, then the eye tracker is not going to pick up their eye movements. When we're using eye tracking, it's helpful if we can calibrate the eye tracker to the individual's eyes. This provides information about the unique properties of that person's eyes that helps to improve accuracy. And it should be performed only after you've achieved a really good position that you can maintain. It's possible in a number of eye trackers to calibrate with as few as 1 points of calibration, but often it's more reliable if you can achieve more points of calibration. Sometimes if somebody can't attend to a large number of calibration points, we'll reduce the number. And you can consider whether you'd want to calibrate to one or both eyes. When the person's selecting targets, they're going to move the cursor by shifting their gaze, and then they're going to have to select by either dwelling their gaze on a certain target for a specified length of time, hitting a switch, or blinking. Blinking only works on some systems. And it's important to know that the precision and accuracy of eye tracking is going to vary across eye trackers for each individual. So it is really helpful if we can try more than one eye tracker out. And when we're doing that, we can look at things like the calibration data, and we can also consider whether the person is able to access all 4 corners reliably. So some of the vision considerations that we should bear in mind for people who are using eye gaze are listed here. And it is important to think about this because eye tracking can be really affected by these, but none of these are necessarily an exclusion for using eye gaze. It's just something that we need to think through. So for people who have cataracts, this can affect the way that light enters the eye. So one thing that we might consider doing is configuring the eye tracker to track the better eye if there's one that's less affected by cataracts. Ptosis is another condition that might affect eye tracking. That's where the person's eyelids droop. It could affect one or both eyes. If there is one eye that's less affected, you could try tracking to that eye. Also, you can ask the vendors that you're considering whether their cameras can compensate for ptosis, because some eye trackers need to see more or less of the pupil. Nystagmus can cause repetitive, uncontrolled eye movements and can reduce depth perception. It may also make calibration less accurate on eye trackers. For some people who have nystagmus, they have a null point where if they're gazing at that null point, those uncontrolled movements of their eyes are minimized. So you can see if ophthalmology has found that they do have a null point. If that's the case, then you can set things up so that they're gazing near the null point when they're using their device, and they may have better access. Strabismus is a condition where the eyes are misaligned, so they may turn outward or inward, and it can affect one or both eyes. You can consider working with the better or less affected eye, and you can also consider using patching, like a nasal side patch might work in some cases. Let's go back. Mydriasis is a condition where the pupils are abnormally dilated. It's often caused by medications such as baclofen. Unfortunately, with mydriasis, it creates some potential for the infrared camera to do harm to the retina. So this would be a case where you'd want to check with the medical team to make sure that it's safe for the person to be using eye tracking, and see if there's any treatment options available to them. Dry eyes can also affect the accuracy of eye tracking because when the eyes are dry, it can affect the way that light is reflected. So if a person is able to use artificial tears, sometimes that can help. You might also think about things like reducing the screen brightness and taking rest breaks from eye gaze so that their eyes aren't getting so dry and fatigued. And lastly, cortical visual impairment can affect functional vision to various degrees. So this is a brain-based vision disorder. It can occur in people who do have other eye conditions or also in the absence of other ocular eye disorders. When you're seeing somebody with CVI, a good starting place is to get a functional vision assessment. So this is sort of something that goes beyond the standard eye tests and looks at their visual functioning and actual tasks where they're needing to search for things, for example. It's going to relate a little bit more to the task of using AAC. Depending on the severity of CVI, for some people, they may need to rely more on auditory information. And so eye tracking might not be our first choice of access methods. We might look towards things where there is more auditory information for them. But there are also a lot of cases where we've had people with fairly significant CVI who, with the right modifications to their AAC system, have still been able to use it successfully during using eye gaze. So this slide goes into a little bit more of some of the things that we might consider if we are tailoring an eye gaze system or any other AAC system, for that matter, for somebody who has CVI. This is information from an article by Krista Wilkinson and colleagues that was published in 2023. And in that article, they emphasize that for people with CVI, it's really essential that we tailor the AAC system display to the specific visual processing capabilities of the person. Some of the factors we might want to consider when we're doing this include things like the complexity of the array in terms of like the number of symbols that we have per array, as well as the number of visual elements that are present within each symbol. Things like the characteristics of the symbols, how familiar they are to the person, as well as foreground and background relationships and color cues. People with CVI might have certain preferred colors, and we could incorporate those into the AAC system, for example. We also want to think about the characteristics of the display. So things like visual crowding can make it hard for the person to scan the display. So adding space between icons may be helpful. Another thing that there's been a lot of work by, especially with Krista Wilkinson and her group, they've been looking at other arrangements like spatial clustering of icons to help with focusing in on a certain area rather than having to scan the whole array. The similarity of icons can make a difference, so making sure that the person can distinguish between them by using different cues like color, shape, and size. And backlighting can be helpful for people to draw their attention. And lastly, we want to think about how we're navigating, whether that's using icons that would add a little bit of visual demand versus touchscreen gestures like swiping or scrolling if the person is touching the device. So there's more to say about this, but I think the main takeaway for CVI is that it's something where we are customizing the AAC system, and we're ideally working in collaboration with a vision specialist to get more information. So I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay here, who's going to start with talking about positioning for eye gaze users. Stop my share here.
Okay, just one moment. I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay, let me make sure I have my audio shared. Okay. Haley, can you still see the slides okay? Yep, okay. Okay. So thank you, Haley. Okay, so let's discuss positioning when it comes to eye gaze access. So some things we want to consider is the individual should be in a comfortable position. We want this to be a position they can maintain versus something unnatural for their body. This may look different from person to person, especially since some individuals have specific positioning requirements due to vision considerations, respiratory status, or motor limitations. This should be a position that is as stable as possible. For example, if relevant, are their feet positioned on footrests? Are their hips far enough back in the chair? Are the arm rests at the correct height, etc.? They should be positioned facing away or shielded from bright lights if possible, and I will discuss this in more detail in the next couple of slides. The speech tuning device should be securely mounted at eye level, parallel to the user's face, at an appropriate distance, and calibrated, as Haley explained earlier, to the user's eyes. And we'll see some picture examples of this soon. It is important to remember that postural stability can have a significant impact on eye gaze access, and that if we are not seeing two eyes, or if the individual is having difficulty accessing parts of the screen, we should reassess positioning. It's important to rule out if it's an access issue versus skills. And we always recommend, obviously, collaborating with our occupational therapy and physical therapists, especially for positioning when possible, as they are amazing resources. Okay, so here we have some examples of non-optimal positioning for eye gaze users. So they should be able to gaze directly at the device without straining their eyes. For example, in position 1, the SGD is simply too high and could cause eyelid fatigue or eye strain at this height. In addition, you might notice the neck is also at an unnatural position, straining upwards towards the device. Positioning the SGD too low and at the wrong angle can reduce the camera's view of the pupil. For example, in position 2, the eye gaze camera does not have a clear picture of the pupils due to the eyelid's natural position at this angle and height. Position number 3 is an example of a device that is, again, too low. And if you notice, most likely not a long-term comfortable position for the neck due to the tilting downwards towards the device. So what are some examples of optimal positioning for eye gaze users? In position 1, you can see the device is at eye level and is parallel to the face. It's quite small, but you'll notice the 2 dots on the screen showing the eyes. The neck and posture are also natural looking and more relaxed than in the previous pictures. In position 2, we can see the device is matching the user's positioning. So this position is most comfortable. Therefore, the device is raised and tilted to again be parallel to the face. We are meeting the user's position versus making them adjust to the device. In position 3, the user's natural comfortable position is tilted to the right. So again, the device is tilted to meet the head position, but is still parallel to the face. Again, it's quite small, but you can see both dots for both eyes. Other important notes are the distance from the face. So Haley mentioned this briefly, but you might need to check the device specifications from the vendor. But in all the optimal positions of the device, you'll notice that it's not that close, because if it's too close, it can impact eye gaze access. The last note on positioning, the positioning and seating in your office or classroom probably will not be the same that it is at home or in the community. So we need to consider different scenarios and positioning needs so their device is accessible in all their environments. Okay, so we briefly mentioned we want to make sure lighting in different environments is also not impacting access to eye gaze. Sunlight and devices which emit near IR light or halogen lamps can disrupt eye tracking. We want to be mindful of sources that produce flickering lights, direct streams of lights, like through a window or something overhead. Closing blinds and curtains, adjusting the individual's position away from direct streams of light, or in some cases using a visor. Another consideration is a low-tech backup, like an E-Tran board, if we are on a busy soccer field with our siblings and bright direct sun. Okay, so we've considered aspects of eye gaze like calibration, vision, and positioning. And Haley has briefly talked about just generally some of the demands that we might want to consider. So let's discuss this a little more in depth of the cognitive linguistic considerations for eye gaze users. Eye gaze involves unique cognitive demands. For example, the individual may need to visually scan the display without inadvertently making a selection. So being aware of how long they might be dwelling on an icon or image. Visually fixate on intended targets while ignoring other possible targets. So like Haley's example of I'm trying to find Wales, but now maybe I'm seeing Spain or France. And so focusing on the intended target. Understanding when a selection has been made. So the cause and effect of that the user is the one making the selection with their eyes. pausing and unpausing eye gaze access to possibly be able to maybe scan in advance without making a selection, or to take a break if you're feeling fatigued or tired, and compensate for inaccurate eye tracking by gazing off center at targets. So realizing you're not selecting it and possibly adjusting to fix that. It is very important that we distinguish linguistic abilities from eye gaze accuracy and proficiency skills. Considering reducing the cognitive linguistic demands during the initial stages of teaching eye gaze access, which might include using eye gaze games or rate enhancement strategies for communication. This might include things like pre-programmed phrases, message history, and considering different language organization methods versus maybe a generic template. Okay, so if we know there are significant cognitive and linguistic considerations for eye gaze, what are some possible modifications that could be used to enhance their AAC access? In this example, we have a duration indicator that is circling like a clock. I'll go ahead and play the video. So as you can see, it's circling like a clock. Also shout out to Bluey, because Bluey's the best. But as you can see, it's circling like a clock, and he's using the individual's favorite or preferred color. This gives feedback to the user while they are dwelling on the individual icons. Depending on the eye gaze, there are various options to customize what the visual might look like, including highlighting the edges of the button or increasing the size of the indicator. When discussing the cognitive and linguistic considerations with eye gaze, we touched on communication rate enhancement strategies, which might look like pre-programmed phrases or different language organization methods. In this example, we have the same language application in all three pictures. The picture on the far right is the language application with no modifications, which may work very well for many individuals. The two pictures to the left are the same language application with alternative display designs, with the demands associated with eye gaze access considered. In the Sowers and Wilkinson's 2023 article Haley has previously reviewed, they discuss how research suggests alternative display designs may be beneficial to users who require alternative access, like the examples on the left and in the middle. As I mentioned before, it is very important that we distinguish linguistic abilities from eye gaze accuracy and proficiency. Eye gaze games are a great way to introduce the skill while reducing the cognitive and linguistic demands. Gameplay that uses cause and effect, like on the Look to Learn gameplay for Talk to Me technologies with popping bubbles, or drawing with lights and colors on the Magic FX gameplay, which is on the, I believe, the i13 and i16 for Tobii Dynavox. There are also websites like Help Kids Learn, which have gameplay for different access methods. As this is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully a place to get started. Lastly, in regards to eye gaze access, we wanted to include resources that you could reference. These are just some helpful resources to help you in working with individuals who might use eye gaze as their access method. The QR codes link you to a number of vendors who have resources and helpful videos and instructions on eye gaze setup for their specific speech generating devices. Okay, so the next access method we're going to talk about is indirect selection with switch scanning. We wanted to first give some examples of commonly used switches that you might have worked with before or worked with an individual who used them. I won't go through every single one in respect of time, but I'll touch on the two switch categories, which are mechanical and electronic sensors. Mechanical switches require manual contact with the switch in order for them to activate. For example, the multi-color button switches at the bottom, which come in various sizes, require pressure from a hand, leg, etc. to press down to use. Same for the pillow switch in the right-hand corner with the cushioned cover for more comfort and long-term use on parts of the body. Electronic sensors are a type of switch that use a semiconductor action. For example, a proximity switch, like the candy corn in the top middle, only requires movement in close proximity to the switch without manual contact, which may be important for someone with reduced tone. Or the sip and puff between the pillow switch and the button switch requires a sip or puff of air to complete an action. This might be a fit for someone with limited movement. So let's talk about types of configuration for switch scanning, as there are quite a few to consider. So one switch scanning, which is the example in this video, which I will play. So one switch scanning, an individual uses one switch that is activated or released when the desired key is highlighted. So jumping down to scanning, the types of scanning, as you can see, this is scanning via row. So for example, one switch auto scan is moving row by row until the user selects a row, and then it will scan right to left. Two switch scanning, an individual uses two switches at different access points. One switch generally moves the scan while the other switch selects the key. And we'll see an example of this in later slides. Other types of switch scanning configurations include auditory scanning. An individual relies on auditory prompts only to scan through the choices. For example, the auditory prompt might say topics, groups, quick fires, greetings, next page. Then the individual will activate a switch in order to select the target and continue to scan through their options. With auditory and visual scanning, an individual is using a combination of auditory modifications like location prompts, which I will reference in a later video, and visual modifications like zoom, high contrast colors, or larger images. Visual scanning, an individual is scanning using vision and does not use any auditory modifications like the ones discussed above. So similar to eye gaze, we're going to talk about kind of the considerations in regards to switch access. So switch access involves unique physical demands we have to be considerate of. For example, the individual needs to be able to activate the ability to activate a switch when they intend to. This takes sustained attention and coordination. With one-step switch scanning, this is a significant demand to time the activation of one switch when intended. Otherwise, they have to wait for the whole scan to run through again. They need to be able to repeat a movement. Therefore, it needs to be consistent and reliable. They need to avoid unintentional selections. Now, this is bound to happen from time to time, but not to the point where it's disrupting them in all communication opportunities. If using a manual switch, they need to coordinate releasing the switch. So they can't just push down and then not be able to coordinate the movement to release it. We have to have an understanding of possibility of fatigue with repeated motor movements and the possibility of repetition motion injury. So considering alternative switch sites or access. For cognitive and linguistic considerations for switch users, we're going to see some common crossovers with eye gaze, but it's still a good reminder. So holding linguistic targets in memory while they execute the motor movement. So remembering what their message is and not getting distracted with the motor act itself. For example, if they use two switch scan and they have to move with one switch through multiple rows and columns of vocabulary and multiple pages to get to a frequently used target, that is a significant demand. They have to move towards an intended target while ignoring other possible targets. So this is similar to the example for eye gaze. Understand when a selection has been made so that the individual is controlling the switches and their outcome, and filter out other competing stimuli with quick changes in the topic, new directions giving, verbal prompts for communication partners. And just like with eye gaze, alternative display designs might be especially important to consider, like communication rate enhancement strategies we've previously reviewed. Okay, so what are some tools and or modifications that could be used to enhance the AAC access for switch scanning? In a study conducted by McCarthy and Associates in 2006, there was a significant difference in learning rate when the magnification modification or zoom feature was used in scanning with typically developing children with no vision impairments reported. So in this video, we see an example of the zoom feature with one switch auto scan. As you can see, as it scans row by row, it's highlighting the first one. And then if you selected it, it would scan down the line. Since we know a possible demand with one switch auto scan can be timing, perhaps in a quiet environment with a communication partner who has prepared you, the zoom feature may not be as important for you to time your selection. But in a busy classroom with your peers running around, zoom as displayed in the video may reduce in part the demands of an auto scan and alert you to your selection. On this slide, we have an example of two switch scan with both auditory and visual modifications.
Keyboard. You
Can.
speak. I. Word forms. It. Do. Go.
Go.
Share. More things. Places. community, stores, hospital, restaurant.
Restaurant. Can I go restaurant?
As you can hear, there is a different voice used to provide location prompts. And then when the individual identifies their target and selects it with the switch, the voice is intentionally different to speak the message. Secondly, there have been intentional changes visually to their display with colors and icon choices. Okay, so in referencing the continuum that Haley reviewed earlier, we want to move individuals with complex access forward on this continuum by understanding the demands that come with learning different access methods. When teaching skills, just like eye gaze, and especially with switch access, it can be helpful to remove the linguistic demands and first start with the motor act. This still very much targets language skills, but allows us to distinguish switch access accuracy and proficiency skills from linguistic abilities. For example, cause and effect switch access games like on the left, where an individual can have the opportunity to interact with their environment through gameplay. This might look like making an instrument play a song or making a funny character move and dance. And this can also be used to turn pages on an ebook or stop and start YouTube videos. Other examples of removing the linguistic demands while still working on switch access skills is using cause and effect switch toys like above. Now, not everyone has access to these types of toys, but cause and effect switch access toys are a great way to isolate the skill of using a switch in really fun and motivating activities. In particular, we absolutely love this Mickey Mouse bar, and the light toy on the right is a particular favorite. So this can just be a really fun way to work on the skill. We included more resources on this final page in regards to switch access. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but a great place to start and explore. Tokyo Gameplay specifically is a free website and allows you to make switch access games. So final thoughts. Haley and I both hope you not only can take away resources and ideas from today's presentation, but with a reminder that an individual's AAC system and access methods should not just work in our speech rooms or clinic settings with only our support. That it is something for an individual to communicate in their busy household while caregivers prepare dinner. It is something functional in all of their languages, and with their cultural identities in mind. That it is for communication in busy boba shops with friends, rambunctious classrooms, and trips to visit grandparents. At the end of the day, access is about helping the people we serve connect with those around them and be more active participants in their lives. It takes time and careful consideration to develop AAC systems that are well tailored to an individual needs, but the results are well worth it. We've included our references here on the last slide. And then we have, I think we're okay on time. Yeah, we have time for questions. We've also included our emails at the end of the slides as well, if you want to email us after the presentation with any specific questions. But thank you so much.
Questions into the chat if you'd prefer, or if you want to raise your hand, then I can unmute you and we can talk.
I did see one question about, can we get a copy of the slides?
Yes, I think if you email me, then I can send you a copy of the slides.
And then in the chat, we also have a question in regards to how individuals can get help with setting up or modifying AAC devices. So who can individuals who use AAC, who can they turn to in regards to that outside of maybe a school team? So maybe I'll let Haley answer.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons that Lindsay and I are working on developing this program here, because we realize that it is hard sometimes to get services. So one option might be to ask for a referral to see us here, and we'd be happy to help. If that's not in the sort of range of where you can go, there are some private practices that specialize in AAC specifically. So I would suggest maybe looking at that option. And there is also a website. It's a little bit out of date. I'm going to look for it and drop it into the chat because it's not jumping into my mind right away, but I'll drop it into the chat when I think of it. They have a sort of older list of providers that do AAC assessments in California. So I'll look for that too. And I see the question about how do we access the recording. So we are still waiting for details about how we're going to post that. But once I have that information, I will be posting on SIG 12 with the information. If you're a member of SIG 12, if you're not and you're interested in getting a copy of the recording, then just send me an email and I'll make sure you get one.
Also on that line of questioning about services, it's just brought to our attention that San Jose State University also offers AAC assessment and treatment services, and it is donation based. And then I also saw a question, Haley, around what vendors does Stanford work with for trials?
Yeah, so we work with several vendors. I'd say so Tobii Dynavox, PRC Saltillo, Talk to Me Technologies, Control Bionics, Forbes. We have worked with other vendors in the past. I'm probably missing some, but those are probably the ones that are most frequent. We've also worked a little bit with iGaze Inc. and iTech in the past. Those are the main SGD vendors, and then there's separate vendors for mounts and switches. Okay, I think I found the website. So if you went to Ability Tools, and I'll drop that link into the chat, there is a section of the page for assessment specifically, and they have a directory for AAC assessment. So I'll drop that part into the chat. And like I said, it's a little out of date, so you might need to call around. Well, I'm not seeing more questions, but please feel free to reach out to us. It was really nice to speak with all of you today, and I hope to hear from some of you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hi, Kristen.
I'll end the meeting. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.